In the remote corners of the Appalachian Mountains, where the mist clung to the trees and the sound of rushing streams filled the air, there was a small, unassuming farm that few ever noticed. Surrounded by dense woods and craggy hills, the farm seemed to be a place forgotten by time itself. A large, weather-beaten barn stood at the edge of the property, its wooden planks darkened by years of storms and sun. The vegetable gardens were lush with produce, each row of plants a testament to years of quiet labor. The house, a modest two-story structure with a sagging porch and chipped paint, sat at the heart of the farm. It was not a place of grandeur, but rather one of serenity, a retreat far removed from the chaos of the world. It was a home not for the masses, but for Evelyn Evie Walker. Evie had spent the better part of her 79 years in the seclusion of these mountains. Her silver hair was always neatly tied into a tight bun, and her eyes, sharp and alert despite her age, spoke of a life lived with purpose and intensity. Her hands, though weathered with age, still moved with precision as she tended to her crops and fed the animals. To those who had the fortune or misfortune of crossing her path, Evie was known as a quiet, polite woman, the kind you'd expect to find knitting on the front porch or picking apples in the yard. However, beneath this exterior was a history that few knew about, a history that, had it been known, would have given any onlooker pause. Evie had once been a legendary sniper, a soldier of unmatched skill, whose marksmanship was feared by her enemies and respected by her allies. She had served in covert military operations across the world, her name whispered only in the highest echelons of the military, her deeds hidden in the shadows of classified files. She had been part of a specialized unit, one that had operated in secrecy, completing missions too dangerous and delicate for conventional forces. Her rifle was her companion, her ability to remain unseen, unmatched. The precision with which she could take down a target, whether from hundreds of yards away or in the midst of a chaotic battlefield, made her a living legend. Yet, after years of service, Evie had left that life behind. She had traded her rifle for a hoe, her camouflage for a sun hat. The world she had known, full of danger, tension, and the weight of human conflict, was a world she no longer wished to be part of. The memories of battles fought, of faces lost, and of decisions made in the heat of war had begun to weigh on her. So, she had retreated to the mountains, far from the world of violence she had once known. She had chosen peace, and in return, the mountains had embraced her. Evie had been content with her decision to leave her past in the past. She was far removed from the world she had once dominated, and few knew of her history. Those who did, the old friends and former colleagues, respected her wish to remain out of the limelight. And for many years, Evie had lived in solitude, finding solace in the rhythms of nature, in the planting of seeds and the tending of crops, in the quiet of the evenings when the stars filled the sky. But not everyone respected her wishes, and not everyone was content to let the past stay buried. In the nearby town, a group of men had heard rumors about a woman living alone in the mountains. These men were no strangers to the criminal underworld. They dealt in things far more dangerous than stolen goods or petty crimes. Their hands were stained with darker dealings, from arms trafficking to illicit trades with dangerous gangs. Word had gotten around about the farm, about the woman who lived there, and about her past, a past that, if true, could prove useful. Some had whispered that she had once been part of a secret government operation, a marksman whose skills could turn the tide of any conflict. Others claimed that she was a myth, a legend of the old wars who had disappeared without a trace. But the rumors had intrigued them. They were looking for a place to hide, a place to operate away from prying eyes, and Evie's farm, isolated, abandoned by authorities, and far from any major town, seemed like the perfect place. They didn't believe the rumors. They didn't believe the old woman living there had any real skills. After all, she was just an elderly woman now, wasn't she? Her days of warfare long behind her. Still, they had to be certain. They had to see for themselves. They would go there, they would intimidate her, and they would take what they needed. So, one quiet afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue across the landscape, they set out toward the farm. There were 6 of them, each armed and ready, their faces hard with determination. They drove up the winding mountain roads, their engines roaring as they neared their destination. As they crossed into the property, they could see the house, in the distance the barn, the stretch of open fields. The place seemed peaceful enough, but it wasn't peace they were after. They arrived at the farm with an air of confidence, believing that they would intimidate the old woman into submission. After all, who would suspect a frail, elderly woman living in the mountains to be anything but harmless? But Evie was not the type to be easily intimidated. As the men pulled up to the barn and disembarked from their vehicles, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, Evie was already watching them from the front porch. She had heard the rumble of their engines long before they had arrived, and she had already begun to prepare herself. She wasn't sure what they wanted, but she knew one thing for certain: they would not get it without a fight. She had lived a quiet life in the mountains, but she had not forgotten the skills that had once made her one of the deadliest snipers in the world. With her sharp eyes, she studied the men as they spread out across the property. They were confident, too confident. They had no idea who they were dealing with. What they didn't know was that Evie's past was never truly gone. The skills she had honed in the heat of battle, the instincts that had kept her alive for so long, were still very much alive in her. They would soon learn that they had come to the wrong place, and they would soon realize that they had crossed a line they could never uncross. The first move had been made. Evie's quiet life was about to be interrupted in a way that no one could have anticipated. The hunter was once again about to take her place in the wild. The evening air grew cooler as the sun dipped lower behind the thick pines, casting long shadows across the land. The group of 6 men, clad in dark tactical gear, rolled up the narrow mountain road toward Evie's farm in 2 black SUVs. Their tires crunched on the gravel driveway as they parked near the barn, their engines cutting off with a sudden silence. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, but the men remained oblivious to the stillness, too focused on their mission to notice anything out of place. Tony, the largest of the group, stepped out first. He was a broad-shouldered man, his face hard and scarred, his eyes narrowing in the fading light. He took a long glance around, but nothing seemed to stand out. "Spread out," he barked, his voice gruff. "We find the old woman and make sure she doesn't cause us any trouble. We'll take the house first. Stay alert." His order was met with the silent nod of the others, who immediately fanned out across the property. They moved with the practiced precision of men who had spent years in this kind of work. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the hunter had already been watching them long before they arrived. Evie had heard the engines long before they came into view, the sound of the vehicles muffled by the thick trees and steep terrain. She had been waiting for them. Her sharp eyes had tracked their every movement from the moment they had crossed the boundary of her land. She knew the terrain better than they ever could, and she had planned every detail of what would happen next. A faint smile tugged at the corners of Evie's lips as she stood on her porch, watching the men move like ants across the yard. They were overconfident, a fatal flaw. They had no idea that she was anything more than a quiet, harmless old woman living in the mountains. But Evie knew better. She knew that they would soon regret underestimating her. She had never been a woman to shy away from confrontation, especially when her home was at risk. As the men split up and moved toward the barn, she reached into the small shed just off the porch. With a practiced hand, she retrieved the rifle that had served her for so many years, a custom-made high-powered bolt-action model, a relic from her past, but still as deadly as the day she had first held it. She checked the chamber, her fingers moving with a fluidity that belied her age. This was not the frail, trembling hands of an elderly woman. This was the hand of a sniper, a ghost in the mountains, a predator lying in wait. The men were busy searching the barn when the first shot rang out. It was almost imperceptible, just a brief whisper of sound before the bullet struck its target. Tony, the largest of them, crumpled to the ground with a single, clean shot to his chest. The rest of the men froze, their heads snapping around in confusion. "Tony!" one of them shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Get down!" But it was too late. The second shot came swiftly and another man dropped to the ground, a red stain blooming on his chest. The others scattered, their training kicking in as they tried to locate the source of the fire. But they were in her world now. Their movements were clumsy, predictable. They were no longer the hunters. They were prey. Evie had already reloaded and adjusted her position. From the loft of the barn, she had the perfect vantage point. The men had no idea where the shots were coming from, but she could see them perfectly, her eyes trained on their every move. She moved quickly, deliberately, her focus unwavering. Another shot rang out, another body fell. Panic set in among the remaining men. They were no longer working as a team. They were splintering, turning on each other, desperately trying to find shelter. But they had underestimated the terrain, the lay of the land. They had no idea that the mountains had always been her ally. Evie knew every rock, every hollow, every ridge. She was the ghost in this landscape, and they were nothing more than intruders. A third shot cracked the silence, and another man collapsed in a heap, his rifle slipping from his hands. The remaining two men, their faces etched with fear, began to run toward the woods, trying to escape. They had lost everything: team, leadership, their sense of control, and now only survival mattered. Evie didn't hesitate. She had anticipated their move. The woods were dense, thick with underbrush and towering trees, but they had no cover from the ridge above. She followed them with her eyes, her heart steady, her breathing slow and controlled. She could almost hear the sound of their footsteps, feel their desperation. They weren't fast enough. She could see the fear in their eyes, the knowledge that they were being hunted. The final man, a younger one with a thin face and wild eyes, reached the tree line, his feet pounding on the earth. He was fast, but not fast enough. Evie had already calculated the distance, the trajectory. From her position atop the ridge, she lowered the scope of her rifle, taking a slow, steady breath. Her finger curled around the trigger, and in a heartbeat the shot rang out. The sound of the bullet cutting through the air was sharp, like the snap of a whip. It was over before the man even knew what hit him. He dropped to the ground, his body jerking once before going still. The last of them was gone. For a moment, there was only silence. The wind rustled through the trees, the world seeming to exhale after the brief chaos. Evie stood still, her rifle still in her hands, her gaze fixed on the lifeless bodies scattered across her farm. Her heart beat steadily, unfazed by the violence that had just unfolded. She hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to kill, but she would not allow anyone to threaten her home, her sanctuary. The sun had fully set now, and the darkening sky cast long, eerie shadows over the farm. The cool evening air carried the faintest trace of smoke from the distant fire pit, a reminder of the quiet life Evie had worked so hard to build. But tonight, that life had been shattered. Evie set the rifle down carefully and stepped off the porch, her boots crunching against the gravel as she walked toward the fallen men. She didn't feel anger, nor did she feel triumph. There was only the weight of what had happened. She had protected her home, but at what cost? The legend of Evelyn Walker would remain a secret, hidden behind the quiet facade of an elderly woman in the mountains, but those who had trespassed here would never forget the name. They would never forget the lesson that some legends were not as dead as they seemed, and that they could always come back when least expected. With a heavy sigh, Evie turned her back to the fallen men and began to walk slowly toward the barn. The world around her was still, too still, but she would return to her life. She had done what she needed to do, and for now that was enough.